Did a pilot really fight with no legs? Could a single map, drawn by a handful of women, change the course of a war? And what happens when a country's last line of defense is a group of foreigners who barely speak the language? The summer of 1940 feels distant now. It's a story told in black and white films. We see planes spiraling through the clouds. We hear the drone of engines. But the real stories are not about the machines. They are about the people inside them and the people on the ground. People who did things that sound like fiction. They were ordinary men and women pushed into extraordinary situations. Some of their stories were celebrated, others were buried in classified files or forgotten in the fog of history. What if the most famous photograph of the battle was staged? What if a pilot survived a fall from 18,000 feet by landing in a snowdrift? And what if the battle's greatest turning point happened by complete accident? These aren't movie plots. They are documented facts from a few desperate months when everything was on the line. Number 15, could a man with no legs really become a flying ace? Yes, his name was Douglas Bader, and his story is one of the most stubborn in military history. It didn't start in 1940. It started 9 years earlier, in 1931. Bader was a young, cocky pilot in the Royal Air Force. He was known for his athletic skill and his contempt for rules. One day, against orders, he decided to perform some low-level aerobatics. His plane crashed. He survived, but just barely. The surgeons had to amputate both of his legs, one above the knee, one below. For a pilot, this was a career-ending injury. It was supposed to be a life-ending one. The doctors didn't expect him to live. But Bader did live, and he was determined to fly again. The RAF told him it was impossible. There were regulations. There was no precedent. How could a man with no feet work the rudder pedals? How could he bail out of a damaged plane? Bader didn't care about regulations. He was fitted with artificial legs made of tin. He learned to walk on them. He learned to drive a modified car. He even learned to play golf. All the while, he harassed the RAF, begging for a chance. He argued, he pleaded, he made a nuisance of himself. As he documents in his biography, Reach for the Sky, the bureaucracy was a bigger enemy than any plane. When war broke out in 1939, the RAF was desperate for experienced pilots. Suddenly, Bader's stubbornness paid off. They gave him a chance. He passed every test they threw at him. He showed them he could control a Hurricane fighter just as well as any two-legged pilot. In fact, some historians suggest his tin legs gave him an advantage. He could withstand G-forces that would cause other pilots to black out because the blood couldn't be forced down into legs and feet that weren't there. By the summer of 1940, he wasn't just flying, he was in command of number 242 Squadron, a unit composed mainly of Canadian pilots who had taken a beating. Their morale was low. Bader, with his abrasive, never-say-die attitude, turned them around. He led from the front, diving into enemy formations. He became a flying ace, credited with over 20 aerial victories. He was also a controversial figure within the RAF command. He championed a tactic known as the Big Wing. Instead of sending up small squadrons to meet raids, Bader argued for assembling a massive formation of 3 or more squadrons to hit the enemy with overwhelming force. His main supporter was Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. But the head of number 11 Group, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who controlled the defense of London, hated the idea. He argued it was too slow to assemble and would leave other areas undefended. The debate between Park's fast, flexible response and Lee Mallory's Big Wing became one of the central strategic conflicts of the battle. Bader, never one to back down, pushed his theory relentlessly. His personal story became a powerful piece of propaganda. The legless pilot who defied the odds to defend his country. It was an inspiration. But the man himself was complicated. He was arrogant, difficult, and dismissive of authority. Many of his fellow pilots found him impossible. Yet they followed him into battle without question. He pushed his planes and his men to their absolute limit. His career eventually ended in 1941 when he was shot down over France and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, making numerous escape attempts. The story of Douglas Bader is well known, but deep questions remain. Was the Big Wing tactic he championed truly effective, or did it waste precious fuel and time, leaving critical sectors vulnerable, as Keith Park feared? Some modern analyses like that in Stephen Bungay's book, The Most Dangerous Enemy, suggest Park's methods were far more efficient for the situation. How much did the constant retelling of Bader's incredible story, both during and after the war, create a myth that overshadowed the contributions of thousands of other pilots? And what did his doctors in 1931 really write in their confidential medical reports about his chances of survival, and have those uncensored documents ever been made public? Number 14, what if the enemy bombed London by mistake? History is full of accidents, a wrong turn, a misread map, a nervous finger on a button. On the night of August 24th, 1940, one of those accidents may have changed the world. At that point, the Battle of Britain was a fight between air forces over airfields. The German Air Force was systematically targeting RAF bases, radar stations, and aircraft factories in the south of England. The strategy was working. The RAF was losing planes and, more importantly, trained pilots faster than they could be replaced. Fighter command was stretched to its breaking point. Civilian centers like London were, by explicit order from the top of the German command, off limits. The goal was to achieve air superiority, not to terrorize the public. But that night, something went wrong. A handful of German bombers, lost and disoriented in the darkness, strayed from their intended industrial targets on the outskirts of the city. They dropped their bombs on central London. The damage was minimal, a few homes destroyed in the East End, but the psychological impact was enormous. This was the first time bombs had fallen on the capital. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, felt it had to retaliate. The decision was made to bomb Berlin. From a military perspective, the British raid on Berlin the next night was a pinprick. It did very little damage, but it had a profound effect on the German leader. He was enraged. He had promised the German people that their capital would never be bombed. He saw the raid as a personal insult and a direct challenge to his authority. In a public speech a few days later, he announced a change in strategy. He vowed to erase British cities from the map. The focus of the air campaign shifted. The primary targets were no longer the RAF airfields and the vital infrastructure of fighter command. The new target was London. On September 7th, 1940, the Blitz began. Hundreds of bombers swarmed over the city. This shift, born out of a mistake and a furious reaction, was a critical strategic error for the invaders. While the bombing of London was devastating for its citizens, it gave the RAF the breathing room it desperately needed. The pressure on the airfields was lifted. The exhausted ground crews could repair damaged planes. The battered squadrons could rest and re-equip. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, the commander responsible for London's defense, later stated that if the attacks on his airfields had continued for another 2 weeks, his command would have collapsed. The German Air Force believed that by bombing London, they could break British morale and force a surrender. They also thought they could lure the remaining RAF fighters into one final decisive battle where they could be wiped out. They were wrong on both counts. Morale did not break, and the RAF, no longer tied down defending its own bases, was free to meet the attackers head-on. The shift in strategy, triggered by a few lost pilots on a dark night, allowed fighter command to survive, regroup, and ultimately win the battle for the skies. The accident of August 24th had handed them a lifeline. The accidental bombing theory is the most widely accepted version of events, but is it the whole truth? Some historians have questioned whether it was a genuine mistake or a deliberate probe by a local commander to test British defenses, an act that was later officially denied to maintain the strategic narrative. What were the exact orders given to the pilots of that specific bomber group? Heinkel, he 111s of Kampfgruppe, 100. That night, and do any unredacted copies of those orders still exist in German archives? And finally, if that raid had not happened, and the German Air Force had continued its relentless and successful attacks on RAF airfields for just one more week, would the outcome of the entire battle have been different? Number 13, could a handful of women in a bunker win a battle? The planes were the stars of the show. The Spitfire and the Hurricane became legends. The pilots who flew them were lionized as the few. But the battle wasn't won in the air alone. It was won in a series of dark underground rooms by people who never fired a shot. And many of them were women. The Corps of Britain's defense was a revolutionary system conceived by Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. It was called the Dowding system. and it was the world's first integrated air defense network. It connected radar stations, ground observers, and fighter squadrons in a way that had never been done before. It was the brain and nervous system of fighter command. At the heart of this system were the operations rooms. The most important one was at RAF Bentley Priory, the headquarters of Fighter Command. But there were similar rooms at the headquarters for each regional group, like the crucial number 11 group bunker at RAF Uxbridge. In the center of this room was a massive map table, showing the coastline and airspace of southern England. Around it stood a number of young women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force WAF. They held long wooden rakes like croupiers in a casino. When a report of an enemy aircraft came in, they would place a colored counter on the map at the reported location. Each counter had information about the number of aircraft, their altitude, and their direction. The color of the counter indicated how fresh the information was. Red meant it was less than 5 minutes old. Yellow was 5 to 10 minutes. Blue was older. This gave the commanders watching from a balcony above a real-time visual representation of the battle. The information came from two main sources. First, the coastal radar stations, known as chain home. These tall towers could detect incoming aircraft long before they reached the English coast. But the radar of 1940 was crude. It could give a direction and a rough estimate of numbers, but it wasn't very precise. The second source was the Observer Corps, a network of thousands of civilian volunteers, many of them too old for active service. They stood in fields and on rooftops with binoculars and a simple plotting instrument. As soon as they saw or heard enemy planes, they would phone in a report to the operations room. The job of the WAF plotters was to take this flood of often contradictory information from radar and observers and create a clear, accurate picture on the map. It was a high-pressure, mentally exhausting job. The fate of the squadrons being scrambled to intercept the raids depended on their speed and accuracy. One misplaced counter could mean the difference between a successful interception and a devastating attack on an airfield. These women were not just pushing counters, they were filtering, interpreting, and visualizing data at incredible speed. They provided what we would now call situational awareness. While the male commanders made the decisions, those decisions were based entirely on the picture created by the WAFs on the map table below. Without their calm, efficient work in the stuffy, windowless bunkers, the doubting system would have been a theoretical concept, not a battle-winning weapon. The Spitfires and Hurricanes would have been flying blind, scrambling too late or to the wrong locations, wasting precious fuel, and giving the advantage to the attackers. The battle was a victory of technology and courage, but it was also a victory of information management, carried out by a group of unheralded women with wooden rakes. We know the general function of the WAF plotters, but what were the specific psychological pressures they faced? A study on the cognitive load of air traffic controllers in the modern era shows extreme stress. What was the equivalent for these women who knew lives depended on their every move? Were there ever recorded instances of deliberate misinformation being fed into the system by spies? And how did the plotters learn to distinguish false reports from genuine ones? And beyond the official histories, do personal diaries or letters from these women exist that describe the day-to-day reality, the fear, and the sheer exhaustion of their work in the bunkers, details that have been lost to the official narrative? Number 12. Why did a foreign squadron become the best in the RAF? When the battle began, the Royal Air Force was desperate for pilots. They had the planes, but they were losing experienced flyers at an unsustainable rate. They needed help, and it came from an unlikely place, Poland. After their country was invaded in 1939, thousands of Polish military personnel escaped to France and then to Britain. Among them were hundreds of highly trained and combat-hardened pilots. Initially, the RAF command was skeptical. The Poles didn't speak English well. They used different tactics and training methods. There was a fear they wouldn't integrate into the rigid structure of the RAF. So they were sidelined, sent for retraining, and made to learn English. But as the situation grew more desperate, in August 1940, the RAF was forced to form two Polish fighter squadrons, number 302, and the more famous number 303. No, 303 Squadron became operational on August 31st. The British expected them to be a decent, if unremarkable, addition to the force. They were wrong. The Poles were lethal. On their very first day in action, they claimed 6 enemy fighters without any losses. This was just the beginning. Throughout September, the squadron's performance was astonishing. In just 42 days of fighting, number 303 squadron claimed 126 enemy aircraft destroyed. This was the highest tally of any squadron in the entire Battle of Britain. They did this while suffering relatively few casualties themselves. The squadron produced a host of aces, including the Czech pilot Josef František, who was flying with them and became one of the top scoring pilots of the entire battle. What made them so good? There were several factors. First, they were experienced. Many had been flying since the mid-1930s and had fought in the invasion of Poland in 1939. Or they had already faced the German Air Force and knew its planes and tactics. Second, their own training was different. The Polish Air Force emphasized marksmanship and close quarters combat. The RAF often taught their pilots to open fire from a safe distance of 250 yards. The Poles would wait until they were as close as 100 yards, sometimes even closer, ensuring a kill. Their eyesight was also legendary. They had an uncanny ability to spot enemy aircraft from huge distances. But perhaps the most important factor was their motivation. They were not fighting for a piece of land or a political idea. They were fighting for their lost homes. They had seen their country destroyed, and their anger and desperation translated into a fierce, almost reckless aggression in the air. As documented by Arkady Fiedler in his classic book, Squadron 303, they fought with a fury that stunned both their allies and their enemies. They often broke formation, diving into the enemy with a chaotic energy that disrupted the carefully planned German attacks. To the disciplined minds of the RAF commanders, this was poor airmanship. But it worked. The German pilots used to more predictable engagements were often overwhelmed by the Poles' ferocity. The contribution of Squadron 303 and all the other foreign pilots from countries like Czechoslovakia, Belgium, and Canada was vital. At the height of the battle, about 1 in 5 RAF fighter pilots was non-British. Without them, Fighter Command would not have had the numbers to survive. The statistics of 303 Squadron are incredible, but they also raise questions. How were their victory claims verified? Given the chaotic nature of their tactics and the language barrier, is it possible their numbers were inflated, either by accident or for propaganda purposes? A question explored by historians like Adam Zamoyski. What was the true nature of the relationship between the Polish pilots and their British commanders beyond the official story of mutual respect? Are there confidential reports detailing the frustration of RAF leaders with the Poles' disciplined but effective methods? And what happened to the detailed combat reports written in Polish before they were translated and filed? Do the original untranslated documents still exist, and could they offer a different perspective on their famous victories? Number 11. Could you build a fake airfield out of cardboard and paint? Deception is as old as warfare. During the Battle of Britain, the British employed a clever and surprisingly effective form of it. They built hundreds of fake airfields, factories, and even cities. These were known as in-queue sites for decoy airfields and starfish sites for decoy cities. The idea was simple. If you can trick the enemy into bombing an empty field instead of a real target, you save lives, equipment, and vital infrastructure. The man in charge of this program was Colonel John Turner, a civil engineer who created a special department for it. His official title was a masterpiece of understatement. He was in charge of scenic displays. The early Q sites were basic. They consisted of a few lights laid out on a field to mimic the runway lights of a real airfield at night. From the air, a bomber pilot looking for a target would see these lights and assume it was a functioning base. They would drop their bombs, and the only casualties would be a few cows and some cleverly designed props. As the battle progressed, the decoys became much more sophisticated. Turner's teams built fake planes out of wood, canvas, and whatever scrap material they could find. They built fake hangars, fake fuel dumps, and fake trucks. They used lighting tricks to simulate activity. A man on a bicycle with a lamp attached to a pole could create the illusion of a taxiing aircraft. They even used controlled fires and explosives to simulate the effects of a successful bombing raid, hoping to convince enemy reconnaissance planes that the decoy was a real and heavily used target. The effectiveness of this program is hard to measure precisely, but the numbers suggest it worked. It is estimated that around 500 German bombing raids were diverted to these fake targets. That represents thousands of bombs that did not fall on real airfields, factories, or towns. The program was so secret that even many people in the British government and military didn't know about it. The teams building the sites often worked in complete secrecy, sometimes causing confusion for local residents and even the Home Guard, who would stumble upon a fully formed but completely fake airfield that had appeared overnight. One of the most famous examples was the decoy site for the Hawker aircraft factory at Langley. The decoy was so convincing that it was bombed repeatedly, while the real factory, just a few miles away, was left relatively untouched. This strategy of deception played a crucial role in the battle of attrition. Every bomb wasted on a fake target was a bomb that didn't damage a real Spitfire or put a real runway out of action. It bought the RAF valuable time to repair, refuel, and rearm. It was a war of illusion, fought with paint, canvas, and light. Proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is not a gun, but a well-told lie. The work of Colonel Turner and his teams is one of the great unsung stories of the battle, a testament to the power of ingenuity in the face of overwhelming force. The success of the Q site seems clear, but how did the British know for sure which raids were successfully diverted? Did they have intelligence from inside the German Air Force, perhaps through codebreaking that confirmed a specific bomber group had targeted a decoy? What was the full budget for Colonel Turner's scenic displays, and how did it compare to the cost of the actual assets it was protecting? And were there any catastrophic failures, instances where a decoy was so poorly made or placed that it inadvertently gave away the location of a real secret installation nearby, a mistake that would have been buried deep in classified reports? And number 10, did a pilot really ram an enemy bomber over central London? On September 15th, 1940, the German Air Force launched a massive all-out assault on London. They hoped it would be the knockout blow that would finally break the RAF. The day is now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the climax of the conflict. In the middle of this huge air battle, one of the most dramatic events of the entire war took place directly over the city, witnessed by thousands of people on the ground. Sergeant Ray Holmes of number 504 squadron was flying his Hawker Hurricane. He had already shot down one enemy bomber and was climbing back into the fray when he spotted another, a Dornier Do 17, heading towards Buckingham Palace. Well, Holmes dived on the bomber, his machine guns blazing. He saw his bullets hitting the plane's fuselage and engine. But the bomber flew on, seemingly undamaged. He attacked again, and again his bullets seemed to have no effect. He was out of ammunition. The bomber was still on course for its target. In that split second, Holmes made a decision. He decided that if he couldn't shoot it down, he would ram it. He steered his Hurricane directly at the German plane. He intended to hit its tail with his wing, hoping to send it out of control. His aim was slightly off. Instead of just clipping the tail, his wing sliced clean through the rear fuselage of the bomber, cutting it in two. The impact sent his own Hurricane into a dive. The cockpit filled with dust, and the controls went dead. Holmes managed to bail out, his parachute opening just in time. He landed on the roof of a nearby building, shaken but unhurt. The wreckage of the two planes rained down on London. The front part of the Dornier bomber, including its bombs, crashed with a huge explosion near Victoria Station. The rear section landed in the street outside. Miraculously, no one on the ground was killed. Holmes's Hurricane, minus one wing, spiraled down and buried itself deep in the ground at the junction of Buckingham Palace Road and Ebury Bridge Road. The story of the pilot who rammed a bomber to save the king was an instant sensation. The press hailed him as a hero. It was a powerful symbol of Britain's defiance. For years, that was the story everyone knew. But in 2004, an archaeological dig in London uncovered the remains of Holmes's Hurricane. They found the engine, the control column, and, most importantly, the machine guns. When experts from the Imperial War Museum examined them, they found they were still loaded. Ray Holmes had not run out of ammunition, so what happened? Holmes, who was still alive at the time, was as surprised as anyone. The most likely explanation is that his guns had jammed, a common problem with the Hurricane's Browning machine guns during violent combat maneuvers. In the heat of the moment, with the bomber closing in on its target, Holmes believed he was out of ammunition and made the heroic split-second decision to ram. The truth, discovered 64 years later, doesn't diminish his bravery. It just adds another layer of chance and mechanical failure to one of the most iconic moments of the battle. The jammed guns theory is the most plausible, but is it the only one? Could there have been an issue with the gun sight mechanism that made Holmes believe he was firing when he wasn't? Forensic analysis of the recovered guns confirmed they were loaded, but could they determine the precise cause of the stoppage? And what of the German pilot, Robert Zabi? He bailed out but was reportedly attacked and killed by a civilian mob on the ground. Are the police reports from that day in 1940 detailing the exact circumstances of his death available for public review, and do they tell a different story from the accepted version? Number 9. What did the battle sound like? We see the Battle of Britain in silent newsreels or in movies with modern sound effects. But what did it actually sound like for the people living under the flight path? The dominant sound was, of course, the engines, but not all engines sounded the same. People on the ground learned to distinguish the different aircraft by their sound profile. The British fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, were powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It had a smooth, high-pitched, almost musical roar. It was described as a continuous, tearing sound. The German fighters, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109, used a Daimler-Benz DB 601 engine. It had a different sound, a lower-pitched, gravelly, and slightly uneven drone. To the trained ear, the sound of a Merlin engine meant help was at hand. The sound of a Daimler-Benz engine meant danger was overhead. But the most distinctive sound was that of the German bombers, particularly the Heinkel He 111. Its two engines were unsynchronized, creating a throbbing, pulsating beat. It was an unnerving, wobbly sound that became known to Londoners as the wum wum wum. It was the sound of the Blitz. And then there was the Junkers Jew 87, the infamous dive bomber. It was fitted with wind-driven sirens, nicknamed the Trumpets of Jericho. As the plane dived, the sirens would emit a terrifying, high-pitched scream that was designed to cause panic and fear among those on the ground. For the civilian population, sound was the first and most important warning system. Before the official air raid siren sounded, people would listen for the distant thrum of engines. They learned to judge the direction and number of planes by the volume and texture of the sound. The silence that followed a major air battle was often just as unnerving as the noise itself. The sounds were not just in the air. There was the constant deafening roar of the RAF fighters taking off from airfields across the south of England. For the ground crews, this was the sound of their work. There was the sharp, percussive chatter of machine gun fire, a sound that carried for miles on a clear day. And there was the crump of anti-aircraft guns, the ack-ack, a sound that was both reassuring and terrifying, as it meant the enemy was directly overhead. Finally, there was the whistle of falling bombs, a sound that grew from a faint hiss to a deafening shriek in a matter of seconds, followed by the deep, ground-shaking explosion. Sound, not sight, was the primary sensory experience of the battle for most people. It was a constant, invasive presence that shaped their daily lives, a soundtrack of anxiety and defiance. The acoustic landscape of southern England in the summer of 1940 was unlike anything heard before or since. Acoustic science is now a sophisticated field. Has anyone ever attempted to authentically reconstruct the soundscape of September 15, 1940 over London using historical data on aircraft numbers, types, and altitudes combined with modern acoustic modeling software? We have written descriptions of the sounds, but are there any surviving audio recordings, perhaps from amateur radio enthusiasts or news organizations, of the actual air battles themselves, unadorned with later commentary? And how much the psychological impact of specific sounds like the wum-wum of the Heinkel contribute to civilian stress and trauma, a field of study that was in its infancy at the time. Number 8 was the most famous Battle of Britain photo staged. There is one photograph that, for many, defines the Battle of Britain. It shows a contrail-streaked sky filled with tiny black dots being watched by a group of observers from a balcony. The image is titled The Battle of Britain 1940. It has been used in countless books, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Perfectly captures the sense of a nation watching its fate being decided in the skies above. The problem is, the photograph is almost certainly not what it appears to be. The photo was taken by a photographer named Cyril M. Power. For decades, it was presented as a genuine snapshot of the battle. But photographic analysis and historical research have cast serious doubt on its authenticity. First, the perspective is strange. The observers on the balcony appeared to be looking up at an incredibly high angle, almost straight up. But the contrails in the sky suggest the planes are much further away, closer to the horizon. The composition feels a little too perfect, a little too dramatic. In 2011, research by the Royal Institute of British Architects, which holds many of Power's works, revealed the likely truth. The photograph is a composite, a clever piece of darkroom trickery. Power likely took a photograph of the sky on one day and a separate photograph of the observers on a different day, and then combined them. Furthermore, the title itself is misleading. The photograph wasn't even taken in 1940 during the battle. It was likely created in 1941, well, after the main fighting was over. It wasn't a piece of journalism, it was a piece of art, a propaganda image designed to capture the spirit of the battle, not to document a specific moment. You know, this doesn't make it a bad photograph. It's a powerful and evocative image. But it highlights the way our memory of historical events is shaped by images that may not be entirely truthful. We think we are looking at a window into the past, but we are actually looking at a carefully constructed narrative. This was not an isolated case. The Ministry of Information actively managed the public image of the war. They commissioned artists and photographers to create works that would boost morale and project an image of strength and defiance. The famous photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral, shrouded in smoke during the Blitz, is another example of a powerful, carefully selected image that came to define an entire experience. The staged photo of the Battle of Britain is a reminder that history is not just what happened, but also the story we choose to tell about what happened. The image is true in spirit, but not in fact. What was Cyril M. Power's original, unedited caption for the photograph when he first submitted it? Did he present it as a documentary shot or as a symbolic composition? Do the original negatives for the two separate images he allegedly combined still exist in any archive? And how many other iconic photographs from that era, which we accept as historical fact, are actually composites, staged events, or carefully cropped images designed to tell a specific government-approved story? At number 7, how did a secretive woman in charge of a pigeon service help win the war? The battle was fought with the most advanced technology of the day: radar, high-performance monoplanes, and complex radio communication. But it was also fought with one of the oldest methods of communication known to man the carrier pigeon. When a British plane was shot down over the English Channel or enemy territory, the pilot's radio was useless. If they survived the crash or bailout, they were isolated. Their only hope of rescue or of getting vital intelligence back to Britain was a small, feathered passenger. Every RAF bomber and some reconnaissance aircraft carried 2 carrier pigeons in a special waterproof container. The pilot's instructions were to release the bird with a message containing their location and any observations about enemy activity. The organization responsible for this was the National Pigeon Service NPS, a civilian volunteer group. But the key figure connecting them to the military was a woman named Olga Dimitriadi, who later became Olga Runciman. She was the head of the pigeon section of the Air Ministry Intelligence Department. It was a deeply secretive role. Olga was a formidable and eccentric character, an heiress who was also a skilled pilot and a passionate pigeon fancier. She understood both the world of aviation and the world of pigeons, a unique combination of skills. She worked tirelessly to create a reliable and secure system. She oversaw the breeding and training of the pigeons, the design of their containers, and the network of civilian pigeon lofts along the coast that would receive the messages. The system worked. Throughout the war, pigeons brought back crucial information that saved lives and provided valuable intelligence. One famous pigeon, Winky, was on board a Beaufort bomber that ditched in the North Sea in 1942. The crew released the bird, which flew 120 miles back to its loft. The message was lost, but the pigeon's arrival allowed the RAF to calculate the general area of the crash, and the crew was rescued. Another pigeon, Royal Blue, was the first to bring a message from a downed aircraft on the continent in 1940. The work was so important that the military created the Dickin Medal, an award for animal bravery. Over 30 pigeons received the medal during the war. Olga's pigeon service was a strange mix of the ancient and the modern. While scientists were perfecting radar, she was worrying about the quality of pigeon feed. While engineers were tuning Merlin engines, she was ensuring the message containers were secure. It was a low-tech solution to a high-tech problem, and it saved lives. Olga Demetriades' role was shrouded in secrecy. What was the full extent of her intelligence work beyond managing the logistics of the pigeon service? Did her pigeons ever carry coded messages intended for resistance networks in occupied Europe, a mission that has never been declassified? What specific breeding and training techniques did she and the NPS use to produce birds that could fly such long and dangerous missions? And are those techniques still used by pigeon racers today? And how many pilots' lives were lost because their pigeon failed to make it back? A grim statistic that was likely never officially compiled. Number 6. Could a pilot's diet really help him see in the dark? During the Blitz, the night bombing of British cities, German bombers seemed to be shot down with surprising frequency in the dark. The British public was told a simple and rather charming story. The RAF night fighter pilots had a secret weapon, and that weapon was carrots. The Ministry of Food launched a massive propaganda campaign telling people that eating carrots would help them see in the dark, just like the heroic pilots. Posters and radio broadcasts praised the power of vitamin A and beta-carotene. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. It encouraged people to eat a vegetable that was plentiful and not subject to rationing, and it provided a plausible, non-secret explanation for the pilot's success. The story was a complete lie. The real reason the night fighter pilots were having success was a top-secret, new technology airborne radar. Britain had developed a small, relatively lightweight radar set, codenamed AI Airborne Interception, that could be fitted into the nose of a fighter plane, specifically the Bristol Beaufighter. This allowed the pilot and his radar operator to see the enemy bombers in complete darkness. It was a game-changing piece of technology. The carrots story was a cover. The government was desperate to keep the existence of airborne radar a secret from the enemy. If the German command knew about it, they could develop countermeasures like dropping metallic chaff to confuse the radar screens. The carrot myth was the perfect misdirection. It was simple, believable, and it played on common folk wisdom about eyesight. The propaganda was so successful that the myth persists to this day. Many people still believe that eating carrots significantly improves night vision. While vitamin A is essential for healthy eyes, and a severe deficiency can cause night blindness, eating extra carrots will not give a person with a normal diet superhuman night vision. The story shows how information and misinformation were used as weapons of war. The British government deliberately misled its own people in order to deceive its enemy. It was a harmless lie, and one that had the added benefit of improving the nation's diet, but it was a lie nonetheless. The real heroes of the night battles were not just the pilots, but the scientists and engineers like Edward Taffy Bowen, who had worked in secret for years to develop the technology that actually allowed them to see in the dark. The carrot story is a classic case of wartime propaganda, but how effective was it in deceiving the German intelligence services? Do captured German intelligence reports from the period show any analysis of the RAF's supposed carrot diet? When did their intelligence services first get concrete evidence of the existence of airborne AI radar, and how did that information leak? And what other cover stories were invented to protect other secret British technologies during the war? Stories that were so successful that we still believe them today. Number 5, why did the British build a plane out of wood? By 1940, the age of the wooden airplane was supposed to be over. Modern fighters like the Spitfire and the Bf-109 were all metal machines built for speed and durability. Wood was seen as old-fashioned, but one British aircraft designer, Geoffrey de Havilland, had a radical idea. He believed he could build a plane that was faster than any fighter, could carry a significant bomb load, and could be built without using the precious metals like aluminum that were in such short supply. His solution was to build it out of wood, specifically plywood. The result was the de Havilland Mosquito. It was nicknamed the Wooden Wonder. Development of the Mosquito began in late 1939, and the first prototype flew in November 1940, just after the main battle. While it didn't fight in the Battle of Britain, its conception and design were a direct result of the pressures and material shortages of that period. The Mosquito was a masterpiece of engineering. Its fuselage was built like a canoe, made from two molded halves of a plywood balsa plywood sandwich. This construction made it incredibly lightweight, but also very strong. Because it was made of wood, it could be built in factories that weren't traditional aircraft plants. Furniture makers, piano builders, and cabinet makers were all recruited to build components for the Mosquito. This decentralized production made it much harder for the enemy to disrupt its manufacture. The plane was designed from the outset with one goal in mind: speed. De Havilland's team made a controversial decision to remove all defensive armament. There were no machine guns or cannons to protect it from enemy fighters. The Mosquito's defense was its incredible speed. It was powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engine used in the Spitfire, and it was so fast that for a long time no German fighter could catch it. The Mosquito went on to become one of the most versatile and successful aircraft of the entire war. It served as a high-speed, unarmed bomber, a night fighter, a reconnaissance plane, and a fighter bomber. Its ability to fly fast and high made it almost immune to interception for much of the war. The Wooden Wonder proved that innovation isn't always about using the newest, most advanced materials. Sometimes it's about using old materials in a new and clever way. The story of the Mosquito is a testament to radical thinking, born out of the desperate necessity of 1940. It was a plane that shouldn't have worked, built from a material that everyone thought was obsolete. And it became a legend. The Mosquito's wooden construction was its great strength, but was it also a weakness? How susceptible was the special glue used in its construction, a urea formaldehyde resin called aerolite, to long-term degradation, especially in humid tropical climates? Are there maintenance reports detailing structural failures due to delamination of the plywood? German Air Force leaders, notably Hermann Göring, are said to have been infuriated by the Mosquito. What do his private diaries or internal memos reveal about the German High Command's reaction to this plane they couldn't catch and couldn't easily replicate? And what happened to the thousands of specialized woodworkers after the war, whose skills were so vital to the Mosquito program? Number 4, how do you fight when you are exhausted? The image of the Battle of Britain pilot is one of dashing, cheerful young men, always ready for a fight. The reality was much darker. The pilots of Fighter Command were pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. They were suffering from a condition that wasn't well understood at the time: combat fatigue. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. During the summer of 1940, a pilot could be expected to fly 3, 4, or even 5 missions a day. Each mission was a life or death struggle. The physical strain of flying a high-performance fighter in combat was immense. The G-forces, the constant vibration, and the need for intense concentration were draining. But the mental and emotional strain was even worse. Pilots lived with the constant presence of death. They would have breakfast with a friend in the morning, and by lunchtime, that friend would be gone. The stress manifested in various ways. Pilots became irritable and jumpy. They had trouble sleeping. They developed nervous tics, like a facial twitch or a constant drumming of their fingers. This became known in the mess halls as the twitch. They lost their appetite. Their youthful confidence was replaced by a grim, fatalistic exhaustion. The RAF leadership was aware of the problem, but they had little choice. There were not enough trained pilots. A man who was still physically able to fly was sent back into the air, regardless of his mental state. The only way out was to be shot down and killed, wounded, or to have a complete mental breakdown. The writer Richard Hillary, himself a Spitfire pilot, captured this reality in his book, The Last Enemy. He described the feeling of being one of the long-term patients of the war. The pilots were trapped in a cycle of intense fear followed by fleeting relief with no end in sight. They were old men in boys' bodies. The strain wasn't just on the pilots. The ground crews worked around the clock, rearming, refueling, and repairing damaged aircraft. They slept for a few hours at a time in workshops and dispersal huts, always on call. The entire machinery of Fighter Command was running on adrenaline and sheer willpower. The battle was not just a test of technology and tactics, it was a test of nervous systems. The fact that the system didn't completely break down is one of the most remarkable aspects of the story. The RAF's medical services must have kept records of pilots who were grounded for nervous exhaustion. How many pilots were officially removed from duty for psychological reasons during the battle, and what was the diagnosis written on their medical charts? Were there any experimental treatments or therapies offered to these men, and were they effective? Beyond Richard Hillary's famous account, do the unpublished diaries or letters of squadron medical officers exist, and do they paint an even starker picture of the psychological toll on the pilots than the official histories allow? And how did the combat fatigue of the British pilots compare to that of their German counterparts, who were also flying multiple sorties a day but were based further from home? Number 3. Could one man's idea have lost the battle? In any high-stakes situation, there are disagreements about strategy. During the Battle of Britain, a fierce and deeply personal conflict raged within the highest levels of the RAF. It was a battle of ideas, and its outcome was just as important as the battles in the sky. The conflict was between two of the most senior commanders in Fighter Command, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park and Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. Park was the commander of Number 11 Group, which covered London and the southeast of England. It was the busiest and most important sector. Lee Mallory was the commander of Number 12 Group, which covered the Midlands and was supposed to act as a reserve, protecting 11 Group's northern flank. The two men had completely different philosophies. Park, who was in the thick of the fighting every day, favored a flexible, rapid response strategy. He would send up individual squadrons or pairs of squadrons to meet incoming raids as quickly as possible. His goal was to intercept the bombers before they reached their targets and to break up their formations. He knew he didn't have enough planes to destroy the enemy completely, so his aim was to disrupt and harass to make their missions as costly and difficult as possible. He needed to get his fighters in the air fast. Lee Mallory, supported by the celebrity pilot Douglas Bader, argued for a completely different approach. And he was the chief proponent of the big wing, or Duxford wing theory. He believed it was a waste of time to send up small numbers of fighters. Instead, he argued that 12 Group should assemble a massive wing of 5 or more squadrons and fly down to join the battle as one overwhelming force. His theory was that this huge formation would be able to destroy large numbers of enemy bombers in a single engagement. The problem was that assembling a big wing took time. By the time it was formed up and flying south, the German bombers had often already hit their targets in Park's sector and were on their way home. Though Park would be on the phone, desperately asking for support, while Lee Mallory's squadrons were still circling over their own airfields, trying to get into formation. The feud became bitter and personal. Park accused Lee Mallory of not supporting him and of sitting on the sidelines while 11 Group was being destroyed. Lee Mallory and his supporters accused Park of using the wrong tactics and of not being aggressive enough. This internal conflict reached the very top of the RAF. After the battle was won, a political battle was fought in the corridors of the Air Ministry. In a shocking turn of events, Park, the man who had commanded the front line and borne the brunt of the attack, was removed from his command. So was the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, the architect of the entire defense system. Lee Mallory, the man whose big wing theory is still debated by historians, was promoted. It was a strange and bitter end for the men who had delivered the victory. The big wing controversy is well documented, but what was the real, unvarnished nature of the communication between Park and Lee Mallory during the height of the battle? Do the full, unedited transcripts of their telephone conversations exist? Modern data analysis could now settle the debate if one were to run a wargame simulation of the battle using historical data. How would the outcome change if Park had adopted the big wing, or if Lee Mallory had committed his squadrons piecemeal as Park requested? And was the removal of Dowding and Park purely a result of this strategic disagreement, or were there other personal rivalries and political motives at play within the Air Ministry that have been glossed over by history? Number 2, what if a pilot survived a fall from 18,000 feet? Survival stories from the war often defy belief, but few are as strange as the story of Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alcomade. His incredible fall happened later in the war, in March 1944, not during the Battle of Britain itself. However, it is a story so fundamentally insane but true about the experience of an airman that it belongs in this company. It speaks to the sheer dumb luck that can mean the difference between life and death. Alcomade was a tail gunner in an Avro Lancaster bomber. On a mission over Germany, his plane was attacked by a night fighter and caught fire. The order was given to bail out. Alcimade went to grab his parachute, but he found it was on fire and completely destroyed. He was trapped in a burning plane, thousands of feet in the air, with no way to get down safely. He had two choices: burn to death in the plane or jump and face a certain death on the frozen ground below. He chose to jump. He closed his eyes and fell out of the rear turret into the night sky. He was falling from an altitude of 18,000 feet, nearly 3.5 miles. He lost consciousness during the fall. He woke up on the ground. He was lying in a snowdrift under some pine trees. He could see the stars above him. He was in pain, but he was alive. The flexible branches of the pine trees had slowed his descent, and the deep, soft snow had cushioned his final impact. He had suffered a sprained leg, some cuts and bruises, and a slight concussion. But he had survived a fall that should have been instantly fatal. He was soon found by German soldiers. When he told them his story, they refused to believe him. They assumed he must be a spy who had been dropped at low altitude without a parachute. They searched for his downed plane, and upon finding the wreckage and his burned parachute inside, they realized he was telling the truth. The German authorities were so impressed by his story that they gave him a certificate testifying to the facts in case his own side didn't believe him. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. His story is a powerful reminder of the role that pure, unbelievable chance played in the war. For every story of skill and bravery, there is a story like this one, a story of surviving against impossible odds. The physics of Alcimade's survival are astonishing. Have modern physicists or medical experts ever modeled his fall to determine the exact sequence of events, the deceleration from the trees, the impact force absorbed by the snow that allowed him to live? While his case is the most famous, were there other less documented instances of people surviving long falls without parachutes during the war? And what was the official reaction at the Air Ministry when they received the report of his survival? Did they conduct their own investigation? And do those confidential reports still exist? Number 1. What does it mean to be one of the few? On August 20th, 1940, Winston Churchill gave one of his most famous speeches. He was speaking about the pilots of Fighter Command. He said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The phrase stuck. The pilots became known as the few. It's a powerful and romantic image. But who were the few? And how few were they? According to the official records, there were 2,937 aircrew who flew at least one operational sortie with Fighter Command during the official period of the battle from July 10th to October 31st, 1940. They were not all British. As we've seen, there were pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Belgium, France, Ireland, and the United States. They were incredibly young. The average age of a pilot was just 20 years old. Many were still teenagers. They came from all walks of life. Some were career military officers, others were former bank clerks, farmhands, and university students. What they had in common was that they were part of a tiny group of men who stood between an invading army and their country. The cost was high. Of the nearly 3,000 men who fought, 544 were killed during the battle. Many more were seriously wounded. Their life expectancy was measured in weeks. The physical and mental pressure was immense, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. The term "the few" focuses our attention on the pilots, but as we've seen, the victory belonged to many others as well. It belonged to the women in the operations rooms plotting the raids. It belonged to the ground crews working 24-hour shifts to keep the planes flying. It belonged to the factory workers building new Spitfires and Hurricanes. It belonged to the civilian volunteers of the Observer Corps, standing in fields with their binoculars. It belonged to the scientists who developed the radar and the dowsing system. The battle was won by a complex network of people and technology. The pilots were the tip of the spear, but the spear itself was forged by thousands of others. The story of the few is true and important. But it's not the whole story. The victory was a collective effort. It was a victory of the many as well as of the few. The number 2,937 is the official tally of the few, but how was this list compiled and how accurate is it? Are there pilots who flew a single, unrecorded sortie whose names are lost to history? What is the full demographic breakdown of these men, not just by nationality, but by age, social class, and pre-war profession? Such a study could reveal a more detailed portrait of who these pilots really were. And finally, by focusing so intensely on the few, have we inadvertently created a historical narrative that minimizes the equally vital, but less glamorous, contributions of the thousands of other people who made their victory possible?